comments. And we do have our director here to make opening remarks in a few minutes. I hope all of you know that we do have comment cards available and collecting them. Sue, can you raise your hand? There's Sue, there. Thank you, Sue. So I have a few. I'm Odette Madriago, Acting Chief Deputy Director for the department, and the leaders, and turn to your left. They're right down the hallway there. The fire exits, you'll see there are 3 exits out of this room, and should that happen, you proceed downstairs and across the street to the park. If you need some coffee or food at lunchtime, there's a cafe on the first floor. We'll be and the final thing that staff has asked me to remind you of, and you'll see it on our opening slide here that's up on the screen, is that as you have comments, .ca.gov. So with that, welcome Director Rafael.
Thank you, Odette. We are here because there is a draft out. There is an informal draft of these regulations. They have been the result of countless hours of work by the people to my right and left, as well as your work. And I want to thank everyone in this room who has stuck with us all these months and given us your wisdom and your observations and your suggestions for how we craft this program in such a way that force and the public and the communities and industries who need to actually pay attention to those details and do what's in them. The purpose of today is really an and, not an or, in the sense that not everything needs to come out today because there are many, many opportunities who aren't here in the room. We have already met with many partners since these draft regs have been out. So the communication back and forth is perhaps one of the most meaningful and powerful parts of doing a draft informal reg, and today is an extension of that. Today is one of those pieces. My expectation is that many of you in this room have already heard something about this regulation, that you might have even seen a presentation on it. So relax, sit back, enjoy Odette's summary. Maybe you'll learn something new in her presentation. She's made it a little more detailed so that we can have some robust conversations today. And that's really what I'm hoping to get out of today. When I when I was thinking, well, what is today all about, this sort of workshop or public meeting? It's really about robust conversation. And the beauty of having it in a large venue is that you can hear other people's thoughts and other people's likes, dislikes, concerns, joys, heartburns in a large forum. After today, we continue to meet with people on a much smaller scale. We welcome written comments as well. And early next year, in the first part of next year, we are going to be putting this together and getting it out in the more formal APA process. So your charge today is to stay engaged, ask questions, give comments, and I know that's what you all came here to do. I am going to go, when I'm done right now, is sit down with you so I can see the screen better. And then what my colleagues will do is after the break is move down, because it feels like we're a million miles away from you, and that's not the point of a robust conversation. And with that, I would turn it over to Odette and thank her very much for the time she took to put together her presentation.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, as you can see behind me from the screen, I think a number of you have probably seen many parts of this presentation, but as Debbie mentioned, there are some further details which we felt were appropriate for the workshop today, since I know some of you will be getting down in the weeds a bit with your comments and questions, which is good. That's where we need to go to get this right. So California's Safer Consumer Product Regulations. As you can see from the tagline that we like to associate with the regulations, these regulations are about identifying safer alternatives and avoiding regret. Comments which staff have asked that I ingrain into everybody's head. Please send all your comments to gcregs@dtsc.ca.gov. So I want to start by just giving you a preview, a really reminder, since I'm guessing all of you have probably already been to our website, but we have the 68 pages of the full regulatory text, the draft regulations. Then there's a 16-page summary with the highlights. There's also a then and now summary that highlights the most significant changes reflected in this draft from the draft that you last saw last December. And there are several flowcharts which are also included in this presentation that are on the website, as well as several videos with Debbie talking about the regulations. You'll also find a copy of this slideshow that I'm presenting to you today is also now on the website. And I think we've probably added other materials on the website recently. So this is one of the graphics that you probably have all seen already, and it's just a reminder to try to, from a big picture overview of what we're talking about and how we're looking at a very large universe of chemicals, somewhere in the 80 to 100,000 range. We're identifying in the regulations themselves, by using a large list of lists, approximately 3,000 chemicals that will be chemicals of concern, starting with the effective date of the regulations. And we will be that contain chemicals of concern. So when we list products, we're going to be listing a product chemical combination. And as the magnifying glass here shows, we're actually only going to be focusing in on a very small number, a handful of product chemical combinations as we begin. This is something very new for all of us, and so we think it's smart to start relatively small as a pilot program, if you will. So again, we'll be starting with a small handful of product chemical combinations that will be listed as priority products, and those priority products will be, the department determines those are necessary. The other flowchart graphic that you will find on the website, which I'll be going into in some detail a little bit later, then for products, the factors that are used to identify priority products, some of the information you'll find in the regulations on alternatives assessment, and then of course this all goes to regulatory responses. Okay. Chemicals of concern. This is the first starting point in the regulations. As I mentioned, the regulations will immediately establish a very robust list of chemicals of concern. Draft regulation is, I believe, 22 lists. That may very well change, as we are getting comments already from folks with suggestions for changes to that list of lists. Used to initiate protective actions to protect public health and the environment from the adverse impacts of these chemicals. So there's been a lot of conversation already about why are we taking this approach, why the large list of lists. So we wanted to share with you our thinking behind this. First of all, we view this as sending an immediate signal to the marketplace, meaning consumers, manufacturers, retailers, the supply chain, about the chemicals that we are concerned with and that potentially could be part of a product chemical combination someday in the future for which an alternatives assessment would be required. Also, something that's very significant about this approach that's different from the prior versions of the draft regulations is it really accelerates implementation of the regulations. By immediately establishing this list of chemicals of concern, the department can immediately start focusing in on the product chemical combinations and get more quickly to the first alternatives assessment and the imposition of regulatory responses. We also believe that this will somewhat deter regrettable substitutions, which was a big concern that a lot of people, including people in the department, expressed about the approach of having a very small list of chemicals of concern. The reasoning there is that when there was a small list of chemicals of concern, it was easier for folks to say, well, I'll just get out of, those 10 or 20 chemicals of concern and pick one of these many others out there. If we determine that something's missing from this list of lists that we feel we really need to focus on, there is a process in the regulations to add to the list. Some other reasons for going with this list of lists. The statute, AB 1879, actually directs the department to take advantage of all the good work done by other states and nations in terms of identifying chemicals of concern. So we're following that direction. It also allows us to focus our resources on product prioritization and alternatives assessment. And this is significant because the work of identifying chemicals of concern is something that a lot of other entities, states, nations have spent a lot of work on. It's frankly not so of particularly and identifying products to focus on alternatives assessments on. There are some states, thankfully, besides California, that are starting to do product chemical pairings to look at those, but they're much more narrow in focus, as you all know. For instance, children's products is what they typically focus on. The other thing is our regulations are the only regulations in the world as of today that require alternatives assessment. So this is what's unique about these regulations, and this is where we think we get the most benefit for focusing DTSC resources. And so that's what we're doing with this approach. We also noted that, you know, there have been some concerns expressed, frankly, about the size of this list of chemicals of concern. And yet we've heard from several trade associations, retailers, that they themselves already have their own lists of chemicals of concern, which are around the same size as what we're looking at. So we think this is, you know, pretty consistent with the approach that's being taken out there. Okay, as I've been mentioning, there is a process in the regulation for adding on to this initial list of chemicals of concern. This process will involve a public review and comment process, and the standard that's going to be used to add on to the list of lists is a narrative standard. And it takes into consideration the adverse impacts associated with the chemical, with a focus on sensitive subpopulations and environmental receptors. It looks at exposures, both potential exposures and documented exposures. It looks at the availability of reliable information to substantiate those adverse impacts and exposures. And finally, it looks at the availability of alternatives. So, for example, if a chemical does have a number of adverse impacts associated with it, there's a high potential for exposure. This is substantiated by reliable information. And we know that there are available alternatives out there for at least some applications of the chemical. That might make the chemical highly likely to be listed as an additional chemical of concern at some point in the future. So now moving to the priority products list. And again, this is a list of product chemical combinations. So for example, we might list nail polish containing formaldehyde. We are only going to list initially a handful of product chemical combinations for the reason I talked about a little bit ago. The regulations do require that the first proposed list, in other words, the release of the draft list for public comment, must be done within 6 months after the effective date of the regulations. So I think this again demonstrates how this version of the regulations will lead to a much faster implementation. And again, like the additions to the chemicals of concern list, the priority product list will be established using a narrative standard. So these are the elements, the key elements in the narrative standard. Obviously, there's a lot more details when you read the regulations themselves. But we'll be looking at the adverse impacts of the chemicals of concern in the product, the potential for exposures to those chemicals of concern, and we'll be looking at market and household presence, which gets to the potential for exposures. We'll be also looking very carefully at who the users are, how they're using this product, how it's being applied. And again, this gets to the potential for exposure. And we will be focusing, again, as with the chemicals, on sensitive subpopulations and environmental receptors. We'll also be looking at the potential for end-of-life exposures and substantiating reliable information and monitoring information. Other regulatory concerns that would be addressed if we were to list a product. Because what we want to do is we want to avoid unnecessary duplication. We want to make our work on implementing these regulations meaningful, and the best way to do that is to provide added benefit over what's already being provided by other regulatory programs. And again, we'll be looking at the availability of alternatives. Are there manufacturers out there who've already found a way to make a safer product that provides the same performance and other benefits? In applying the narrative standard, the factors that are included in the narrative standard, the regulations do call out some key factors. And in a way, I guess you could say these are the prioritization factors that we believe are most important. These include, is there the significant potential for the chemical of concern to have adverse impacts? Is the product widely distributed and used? Is there a significant potential for exposures? For assembled products, there will be a greater concern if exposures could come via inhalation or dermal contact. For formulated products, we're looking at how is the product applied. If it's applied to the directly to the body, if it's dispersed as a vapor or aerosol, or if it's applied to a hard surface with the likelihood of runoff, then there's a greater concern. Because as many of you who have been following these regulations know, there's been discussion about other approaches, some sort of a much more structured approach or a weighted approach. So here's why we feel the narrative standard is the best way to go. One, we want this to be a forward-looking regulation that can continue, only approach that will provide us the flexibility to do this and to take advantage of scientific advances, advances in technology. And ultimately, we think that this approach, because it does allow us to use new information in the future, is scientifically meaningful and practical. We really felt that the other approaches that had been talked about, the structured approaches, the weighting approach, moving forward with the best science. So I want to point out that there is included in the regulations a petition process that allows anyone who wishes to petition the department to consider a chemical or a product using the chemical of concern or priority chemical or product to assist them in their regulatory responsibilities. Now, it's important to note here that when we get to the end of the petition process, we look at completeness and then we look at the merits of the petition, and if we grant the petition, that doesn't automatically mean that that chemical or product gets listed. It means that the next time we go to add to the list of chemicals of concern or add to the priority products list, that we will evaluate that chemical or product using the same process and factors that we would for something that we initiate. And the same public process, I should add. So again, taking us back to our overview, so we've now narrowed down from the 3,000 plus chemicals of concern and the many products that contain those chemicals of concern, we've now narrowed ourselves down to a handful of product chemical combinations for which alternatives assessments will be required. The approach that we've taken in the regulations with alternatives assessment is a phased approach. It starts with a priority product notification or a de minimis notification. Then there'll be a preliminary report and a final report. So manufacturers will be touching base with the department 3 times if they have a priority product. We've taken an approach that provides some flexibility, both in terms of set the general standards for the alternatives assessment. There's obviously a lot of details that are missing from the regulations, but these will be provided as we develop the guidance documents which the regulations require us to provide. And we hope that many of you will partner with us in developing those guidance documents. And we envision that there will need to be different guidance documents for different types of products, because the approach to the alternatives assessment will be somewhat different depending on the if you have good eyesight. So this slide basically shows the first stage of the alternatives assessment process. There are 2 stages. The first stage is completed, and then a preliminary alternatives assessment report is submitted to the department. Then we proceed to the second stage, and then the final report is submitted. So the first stage for the alternatives assessment begins with an identification of the product requirements, the function, performance, feasibility, and legal criteria that you, the manufacturer, say are important for your products. Then we ask you to look at the function of the COC in meeting those requirements, and to ask the question, is the COC or a substitute chemical necessary to meet those requirements? Step 2 is the identification of alternatives. And again, these would be alternatives that would meet the product requirements that have been identified that are aimed at reducing or completely eliminating the COC in the product, and or reducing or eliminating exposures to the COC in the product. And we ask folks to look at existing alternatives that may be out there. And I want to emphasize here that when we say alternatives, we're not just talking about chemical substitution alternatives. We're also hoping that people will, where it's viable, look at product design alternatives that either eliminate the need for the chemical of concern or significantly reduce the exposure potential to the chemical of concern. Then step 3 will be an initial screening, and this is a screening of alternative chemicals that are being considered. So if some of your alternatives involves a chemical substitution, we ask that during the first stage of the alternatives assessment that you do the comparison of adverse impacts among the various chemicals being considered. And we do specify in the regulations that if some of the chemicals initially considered are worse than the chemical of concern in every way, you can eliminate that from further consideration. In fact, we actually encourage it for obvious reasons. So the fourth step is to submit a preliminary AA report to the department that talks about the work that has been done in stage 1 and sets forth a work plan for the second stage. And when we say comparison factors, we're talking about the ADM factors, as we refer to them, that are listed in the statute AB 1879. The statute says that alternatives assessments must consider 13 factors, listed as A through M. So the way we are asking people to meet that statutory requirement is to ask the question for a given product, an alternative comparison, which of those factors are actually relevant to comparing the product and the alternative. And we define relevancy in the regulations. And in conjunction with looking at which of the factors are relevant, we ask that you look at which exposure pathways and which life cycle segments are relevant for the comparison. So this is how you narrow down the scope of the alternatives assessment to what really matters for purposes of the product and the alternatives. Where it's not, then use qualitative analysis and use available data. It's, as I'll note later on, there is not a requirement in any product and the alternatives you've identified using the relevant comparison factors, exposure pathways, and life cycle segments. Following the comparison, the manufacturer, the person acting on behalf of the manufacturer and performing the alternatives assessment, then makes a decision. And that decision may be that you're going to retain the priority product, or hopefully you found a better, safer alternative that you are going to put on the marketplace in lieu of the existing product. So this analysis that you've gone through, as well as your alternative selection, will be documented in a final alternatives analysis report, which will include the reasons and the justification for your decision, and that will be submitted to the department. Okay, I mentioned that, we've tried to build in some flexibility in terms of the approach used to conduct the alternatives assessment. We've laid out, a basic framework for doing an alternatives assessment in the regulations. And we did this to give folks who wanted kind of a recipe to follow, something that they can follow and say, okay, if I follow this process, I know I've complied with the regulation. But we also realized that other people out there have or may in the future develop other ways of approaching alternatives analysis that get to the same endpoint. And we want to provide the flexibility for those other approaches to be used. So in coming up with a term for this, we're calling these equivalent substitute approaches. So a substitute alternatives assessment approach can be used if that approach will look at the same comparison factors, exposure pathways, and life cycle segments that would be looked at if the approach set out in the regulation were followed. That's going to be the key criteria to work plan to the department up front, laying out what your approach will be. Data gaps. There is no requirement in the regulations to fill data gaps, for example, hazard trait information during the alternatives assessment process. We recognize that for many chemicals that there is not complete hazard trait or other information out there. We are asking that you gather what information is available. If you want to generate new information, that's certainly encouraged, but there's not a requirement to generate new information. There is a requirement. The department may, at that point, require that you go back and fill certain data gaps if we determine that there is a critical need to do so. It will avoid lengthy delays in completing the alternatives assessment and in getting to the assigning of regulatory responses. As many of you know, filling some of these maybe wasn't really necessary, but it could significantly delay the implementation of this program. And we have the backstop in that DTSC would be retaining the authority to require filling of those data gaps that we determine are necessary to be filled. Quality assurance for alternatives assessment. The approach we've taken in this iteration of the draft regulations is a three-prong approach. One, there are DTSC audits. We've always had that in the regulations, but in the past when we thought the list of priority products would be much larger, we did caution folks that we would not be auditing each and every alternatives assessment. With this approach where we're keeping the number of priority products and alternatives assessment to a much smaller number, we believe that we will be able to do meaningful audits on most, if not all, alternatives assessment. So that's prong one. Prong two, the regulations include provisions in a program for certifying assessors to conduct AAs. The regulations have qualifications that these assessors need to comply with, and the department would be designating one or more accreditation bodies to accredit or to these assessors. And then the regulations require that beginning January 2015, all AA reports, and we recognize that that will limit the degree to which public review can assure quality assurance. But we still think there is a role for public review in terms of did we get it right? And so we encourage comments, questions, suggestions, specific suggestions in particular, on all aspects of the regulation. This is one in particular where we are really asking folks to take a hard look and give us some specific recommendations if you have them. Okay, after alternatives assessments have been completed and the final AA report submitted to the department then reviews the AA report and the alternative selection decision and determines if a regulatory response is necessary, still contains the COC or contains another chemical that poses a concern. And there are about a half dozen regulatory responses that are listed in the regulations. There's also a provision in the regulation that provides an exemption from a regulatory response imposed by the department if that creates a duplication or a conflict with an existing state or federal requirement. And the regulations set forth a process for obtaining that exemption. Responsibility for compliance. I've been talking a lot about what the requirements for compliance are: the submission of a priority product notification, the performance of an alternatives assessment, and complying with regulatory responses. So the way we've approached this is the manufacturer of the product is the one we view as the entity that should be primarily responsible for complying with these requirements. We think that makes sense. The manufacturer is the one that best knows their product. They're the ones who call upon the importer of the product to fulfill those responsibilities. And finally, if neither the manufacturer or the importer do, then it's up to the California retailer to either fulfill those requirements or to cease selling that product in California. There are other options for the manufacturer and the importer to also opt out of compliance, again, by ceasing to place that product into the marketplace in California. Now, the way that importers and retailers are going to find out that manufacturers aren't complying, we're going to be posting the notices of noncompliance on our website, and there will be a failure to comply list posted on the website as well. And there'll be notices to our listserv, and we're going to be flooding the market with information so that folks know that there's a problem out there they need to address. So the consequences of failure to comply is we have the authority to take various enforcement actions and to impose penalties. De minimis, this is in the approach we've taken previously. As before, if your particular product has the COC below the de minimis level or doesn't have the COC at all, then no alternatives assessment will be required for your particular product, but you must notify DTSC of this. The de minimis level that we've set in these regulations is 0.01% for chemicals that exhibit one or more of 9 specific hazard traits that are spelled out in the regulation. For all other chemicals, the de minimis level is 0.1%. And the regulations spell out criteria for the department to consider if it chooses to set a lower or higher de minimis level. The de minimis calculation, it's the cumulative concentration of all chemicals of concern that exhibit the same hazard or multiple chemicals of concern. For formulated products, it's going to be the cumulative concentrations in the entire product. For assembled products, it's going to, I think, will be true in many cases when we're dealing with assembled products. Just a few other regulatory that provides the ability for manufacturers and other responsible entities to dispute a decision by the department that affects their particular product. And finally, there is a section on trade secrets, which largely mirrors what's in the statute. I'm not going to go into any details on these sections, but of course we are open to questions and comments. So briefly, before we start with our public comments, let's talk about next steps. This Thursday, December 8th, the Assembly Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee is having a hearing. I believe it starts at 10 o'clock over in the Capitol. And some of you, I think, may actually be testifying at that hearing. The rest of you may be interested in listening in. We've asked that folks give us comments and then entering into the formal APA public comment process, which will be for 45 days. And we anticipate that beginning somewhere around the end of February or so. And we're looking to final adoption of these regulations probably in the fall. Could be sooner, effective date of the regulations. And once we have put out the final priority products list, then manufacturers have 12 months after the department approves the preliminary alternatives assessment report. I do want to point out that there are provisions in the regulations for extensions to these timeframes, as well as some flexibility, particularly with respect to the final alternatives assessment report. The due dates for the regulatory response implementation, these are specified in the regulations for a couple of regulatory responses, and so that is the conclusion of the slide presentation. I just want to remind you again of the website where you can find this and all the other information concerning the regulations, and again, the email address for submitting comments. So can somebody bring up the lights and turn off the show? Thank you. Okay. As Debbie mentioned, is Debbie? Yes, she's still here. We will be, we'll be taking a break in a little bit, and when we do that, the staff and I will be moving down to those mics down below so we can be closer to you as you are providing your comments to us. So I want to start by just laying out by reading off questions that were submitted to us by email last week and the prior week, and the staff and I will be responding to those questions. Then we will be taking the break, and following the break, we will then open it up for comments and questions from the audience. And I'm going to start first by calling off those of you who submitted emails to us specifically requesting time to speak, and that will then be followed by those of you who have submitted comment cards today. We will do the best we can to call up speakers in the order that the comment cards are submitted. Noontime, when we'll take a 1-hour lunch break, and then we will reconvene and continue with public comments. We will be asking when you make your comments to stay to 5 minutes, and we have a timekeeper who has cards. Daphne, there's Daphne. She'll be holding up time warning cards, and so we are asking you stay to 5 minutes. There will be an opportunity later on in the afternoon after everybody who has requested to make comments and has had their initial opportunity. If you would like to get up again and make additional comments, we welcome you to do that. So with that, okay, so now these are questions that we received from folks who submitted an email and who seemed to indicate at least that they would not be attending the workshop. And this first set of questions comes from Casada Chen, who represents the Petragon Corporation. Her first question is, what is the determination of consumer products, and does this include electrical and electronic equipment? The term consumer product is actually defined in the statute, specifically in Health and Safety Code section 25251. And it's a very broad definition, and I'll just quickly read it to you. It says, a product or part of the product that is used, bought, or leased for use by a person for any purpose. So this is very broad. There are, as many of you know, some limited exemptions from this definition in the statute, but those definitions do not include electrical or electronic equipment. So in response to the question, it is conceivable that electrical, electronic equipment is this regulation compulsory or voluntary now or into the future? The provisions of the regulations are compulsory. They manufacture or that they sell to their consumers. And so we are hoping that this will actually expand, and that going forward more and more retailers and manufacturers and importers will voluntarily conduct alternatives assessments and voluntarily work towards keeping dangerous chemicals out of their products. Casada's third question is, who will conduct the alternatives assessment? Will it be the lead assessor? Who or what is a lead assessor? And I suspect the use of the term lead assessor comes from the prior version of the regulations, because we no longer use that term in the draft regulations. We use the term certified assessor. And as I went over during the presentation, the regulations require that starting in January 2015, alternatives assessments be performed under the responsible charge of a certified assessor. But I will read it off. Is section 69501.3A2 states that the requirements of the chapter may be fulfilled by a consumer, and yet many provisions of the regulations, especially the preparation of alternatives assessments, would likely raise antitrust concerns for relevant regulators and prosecutions so as to maximize their potential in this regulatory process. So Colleen is our attorney on our regulations team.
To regulated entities under the federal antitrust laws. That being said, there would be some ability on our part to try to foster or work with the regulated entities to allow them to meet their obligations under the antitrust laws and under these regulations. So there would be a question of our using flexibility and implementation to try to foster or advise or guide companies so they can maximize resources with other regulated entities and still not violate their obligations under the antitrust rules. So it's going to be difficult to determine. It's going to be very case specific. Courage to seek their own legal counsel from their own attorneys, how they can stay within these two regulatory regimes, the antitrust regime and this regulatory regime. Sorry, I can't be more specific than that, but that's just really a fact of, it's going to a lot of it is going to depend on how this is implemented and played out.
Contemplated substitution of the chemical of concern in a product by other chemicals as the sole alternatives to be considered. In this draft regulation, the definition of alternative also includes product redesign measures that would lead to exposure and risk mitigation. Many of the components required by the alternatives assessment report may not be relevant for these kinds of engineering controls. So the question is, can the department consider some simplified, briefly clarifying that actually all of the prior versions of the draft regulations, at least the ones I've been involved in, did actually contemplate that manufacturers not be required to spend time looking at comparison factors that aren't relevant to a particular product and its alternatives. However, I'm not clear what the question is with respect to, is there some simplified elements that we could substitute into the AA report requirement. So I hope that Paul, today or some other day in the future, we can talk about this further and get a better idea of what you might have in mind. So in response to this question, this really gets to when we list a product chemical combination on the priority products list. And as I mentioned earlier, when we list a formulated product, it's going to be the entire product, basic component of the assembled product. And this will be specified out in the priority products listing. And the significance of this is that it will be, if we list the component, it will be the component to which the de minimis calculation is applied. The component is also the minimum required scope of the alternatives assessment. The manufacturer, of course, has the option to look more broadly at their product, but the minimum requirement is to look at that component that is listed. So, you know, really, any of the examples that Marjorie has given in her question are potential for listings on the priority product list. And I think that's about all I have in response to that question. I have the following scenario would be treated within the regulation. A manufacturer does not intentionally use the chemical of concern listed for the priority product in the priority product listing, although the chemical of concern may be present at a contaminant level below the de minimis level in the product. And the product does contain other chemicals of concern, not the one for which the product is listed, but other chemicals. There's two questions with respect to this scenario. The first question is, would the manufacturer be required to submit any type of notification? Product notification would be required because under this scenario, the listed chemical of concern, along with other chemicals of concern exhibiting the same de minimis exemption. And would the alternatives assessment specifically address the other chemicals of concern in the absence of the targeted chemical of concern for which the product is listed? The answer to both these questions is no, if the listed chemical of concern is not present at all in the product. And again, this is regardless of whether the chemical of concern is intentionally added or a contaminant. Okay. The next individual requesting that we regard was with regard to the petitioning process. Section 69-504 identifies a petition process for adding a chemical is, let me see, there is not a detailed process in the regulations for removing a chemical from the chemical of concern list. And will DTSC be amending the regulation to address such a process? Actually, the regulations in the section that calls for how we add chemicals to the initial chemical of concern list, it also provides that we can use that same process, which is a public comment process, to remove chemicals from the existing list of chemicals of concern. So the regulations do, in fact, address this issue, and it is a public process. Okay, next question. The summary of the informal draft regulation states that DTSC anticipates that the initial list of priority products will include 2 to 5 products. This specific language is absent in the actual draft regulation. How come? For clarification purposes, does DTSC plan to incorporate this statement in the regulation itself? We actually made the intentional decision not to specifically tie our hands in the regulations in this manner. In case we decide for some reason we want to list a 6th or a 7th priority product in the first go-around, we want to retain the flexibility to do so. Next question, which I'm going to be throwing to Colleen to answer. What, if any, flexibilities or accommodations will be afforded to the small business manufacturers that may lack the infrastructure and resources of their larger competitor, particularly when it comes to completing the alternatives assessment? How does DTSC plan to mitigate the cost and time impact for small businesses?
Conceding a lack of authority, we thought it was safer, more prudent to not have an express provision creating special treatment for small businesses, but rather to proceed by binding ourselves to having to write alternatives assessment guidance before alternatives assessments are required of responsible entities. We also have the provision for the publication of alternatives assessments that are in the public domain, which will perhaps disproportionately aid smaller businesses as opposed to larger businesses. We again have the consortia provision that may be more beneficial to small businesses. And then finally, we have the fact that the alternatives assessment requirement itself creates quite a bit of flexibility for those doing AAs to set scope and level of detail. Obviously some outer bounds on that in the regulations, but it's not a lockstep process by any means. So that's kind of the tack that...
And would we include in this costs of not only replacing chemicals, but also what the alternatives will mean in terms of costs for the consumer? And so in response to this, I think the basic thing I need to point out is that the evaluation and consideration of economic impacts will actually be the responsibility of the manufacturer as part of the alternatives assessment process, not DTSC's responsibility. You know, DTSC does is reevaluate to see if revisions are necessary. But in terms of actual implementation, we do not ourselves have a role in evaluating the economic impacts associated with an alternative analysis decision. And we don't have any plans for establishing economic impact metrics, if some with Commonweal. Davis's first question, which I'm going to ask Jeff to respond to, is please explain how cumulative exposure will be measured.
Refers to cumulative exposure in the context of de minimis, and the de minimis level is really a concentration based. It's not exposure. So I'm a little unclear how cumulative exposure would again be integrated. And I'll just jump to question number. It says, please clarify how nanomaterials will be addressed in the regulation. We had anticipated, as you had seen in previous drafts, on how to consider nanomaterials. Be able to consider nanomaterials if the need arises. There have been some stakeholder comments and even comments from our Green Ribbon Science Panel members that have stated that they don't feel that the language currently in the regulation is adequate. And so we're looking forward to contributions from our stakeholder community to bring that to more in line with their thinking. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, Davis's second question is, will the informal draft regulations say anything about how the guidance documents for alternatives assessments will be developed by DTSC, including a timeline? The regulations do, in fact, require that the first guidance documents actually talk about how we'll develop those guidance documents. And I'm not clear what Davis has in mind, and that, Davis, that may be something you want to provide us some clarification on today or in future conversations. And we would be happy to consider anything that you think we need to address along those lines. Be considered. The program will start with 2 to 5 product categories. The 2 draft examples given at the grasp were BPA and teething rings and formaldehyde and nail polishes. The process will likely take more than 3 years if all runs smoothly. Is this pace of output, or is this the pace of output we should expect as the program runs into the future? So as I've already said, I think several times today and many times prior to today, the reason for limiting the first list of product chemical combinations to just a handful is because of our resource limitations, as well as the fact that we think, now in terms of what will happen going forward, I don't know the answer to that. You know, I think as long as we continue to have to see what happens. And Davis's last question, which I'm going to throw to Colleen, is how will the lack of transparency in the alternatives assessment process build public confidence in the program? This is a crucial component for a successful program.
Thank you. The existence of the existing law protecting trade secrets in California under the Uniform Trade Secrets Act, which California has adopted. That being said, so there is trade secret protection available for information that in fact is trade secret. The department, so that meaning that last statement, the qualifier is it's not an automatic treatment by one simply claiming the status. The claim of trade secret protection is subject to confirmation by the department, which is why we've written the regulations to inform the world that any claim of trade secret will be followed up by a request for justification by the department. And the elements of what's required in the justification track quite nicely with what's required that's developed in the body of law protecting trade secrets. We're trying to strike the balance here between the public's need and right to know and the legitimate business interests that are served by the fact that certain information is deserving of trade secret protection. And we're open to, again, as all other areas of the regulations, comments as to how our treatment of this topic can be improved. But basically, we've tried to build on existing law and be respectful of what the legislature told us, which is there's only one category of information that's per se ineligible for trade secret protection. So you'll find the regulations are quite modest in scope, and we think are in keeping with existing jurisprudence in this area.
Thank you, Colleen. So our last question from the advance emails comes from Emily Kolarick. C plan to communicate to the public the initial list of chemicals of concern. The regulations, in fact, require DTSC to post on its website an informational list of the chemicals designated by the regulations as the initial list of chemicals of concern based upon being on one of the list of lists within 30 days after the effective date of the regulations. We are currently working on developing this draft informational list, and we are hoping that actually we will be able to make it available for information purposes sometime prior to adoption of the regulations. It might be closer to sometime during the 45-day comment period, because I am anticipating, based upon comments we've got already, that we'll be making some putting out for the 45-day public comment period. So that concludes this section of the public comment process. We're now going to take a short break. It's now 5 minutes to 11. I'm going to ask you to be back here by 5 minutes after 11. And I'm then going to call up those of you who submitted emails in advance requesting time to speak. And after that, we will move on to the comment cards. Thank you. Okay, everyone, if I can ask you to take your seats so we can get going here. Okay, come on, guys. I need you to set an example, please.
This lady has 4 kids, so she would like to go first.
Well, no. I can't start making exceptions. Okay, we have 10 people who were kind enough to alert us in advance by email that they wanted time to speak. So out of respect for their taking the effort to do that, I'm going to be calling the 10 of you up first in the order that we received your requests. Some of you, I believe, okay, Jeff, I'm making an announcement, please. After that, we will be going to the comment cards, and as I mentioned, we will be doing our best effort to take them again in the order submitted. Some of you who submitted us advance requests by email, I believe, have also given us comment cards. If when I call your name, based upon your email, you wish to defer to the comment card process, you may do so. And I want to remind you again, we are allowing up to 5 minutes per speaker. You will have an opportunity to come back up later if you feel you need more time. And Daphne, show them your time cards. So she will be giving you warnings, and you have a microphone to tell them it's over? Okay, all right. All right, our first speaker is Felipa Rio from the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. Felipa, okay. Oh.
Good morning. Yes. Okay. My name is Felipa Rio, and I'm Senior Manager for Environmental Affairs at the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. The Alliance is an association of 12 vehicle manufacturers, including BMW, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, Jaguar Land Rover, Mazda, Mercedes-Benz, Mitsubishi, Porsche, Toyota, Volkswagen, and Volvo. Together, we represent approximately 80% of new car sales in the U.S. The Alliance and its members appreciate the opportunity to provide comments here today. We support green chemistry goals, and we thank DTSC for its hard work on the third draft of Safer Consumer Product Alternatives Regulation, which contains several provisions that are a step in the right direction. In particular, the Alliance is pleased that the AA requirements are self-implementing, that they do not require expensive, duplicative third-party certification, and we support the focus on exposures, such as inhalation and dermal contact, in the department's scheme for selecting priority products. Further, we are pleased that the new draft recognizes the distinction between simple and complex products, as well as formulated and assembled products, and that this draft makes some progress in ensuring that the entity with the most knowledge and the discretion regarding the inclusion of a chemical in a product is tasked with performing the AA. Although further revisions are necessary to accurately capture this intent, we are pleased that refining these distinctions is a goal of the new draft. Also, we are glad that this draft recognizes that a threshold of 0 is impractical and provides for a de minimis threshold. However, we have serious concerns about any threshold below 0.1%, which is the accepted threshold throughout the world with limited exceptions. This threshold allows for the tracking of 99.9% of listed materials and products. To track at a lower threshold essentially dismisses this effort for minimal gain and will divert precious resources away from important R&D searching for safer alternatives. We urge the department to maintain the de minimis threshold at 0.1%. Overall, we remain very concerned at the lack of prioritization of the list of chemicals and lack of identification of the priority products in these regulations, which fail to give our members the predictability and certainty on which to base their investments into future materials and product design. Moreover, we are concerned that the lack of predictable criteria will work to substantially defeat the goals and visions of the statute, which is to stimulate innovation in green chemistry. Several Alliance members will be testifying here today on other outstanding issues with more details. We hope you will consider those comments as well in your next draft. The issues include the overly large list of chemicals of concern and the reliance on the Global Automotive Declarable Substance List, or GADSL, as a justification for that list, the lack of a provision for legacy or replacement parts, and the overly broad regulatory responses such as the financial guarantee and product recall. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments, and I look forward to our continued work.
Thank you, Philippe.
Thanks.
Next requester is Barry Morse with Volvo Cars.
I believe that I'm also on a card and in a different sequence on the card.
So, your choice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Barry Morse, and I'm a senior regulatory engineer. My name is Barry Morse. I'm a senior regulatory engineer speaking on behalf of Volvo Car Corporation. Volvo thanks the panel for this opportunity to comment on the upcoming Safer Consumer Products regulation. We support the goal of minimizing the health and environmental impacts of products that we use. Approximately 80% of the material content in every vehicle is recycled, reused, or reclaimed at end of life. Volvo recognizes the need for and supports product stewardship and end-of-life management of selective products. In fact, like other vehicle manufacturers, Volvo already exercises daily control and recovery via dealership parts departments and automotive dismantlers of a wide range of automotive components that have reached the end of their useful lives. As currently drafted, End-of-Life Management Requirements Section 69506.4 would require manufacturers to fund, establish, and maintain an end-of-life management program for any product required to be managed at the end of its useful life as a hazardous waste in California. Section 69506.4 would require a comprehensive product stewardship plan, setting forth the means by which end-of-life management will be undertaken. It includes exhaustive definitions of roles and responsibilities for all involved parties, scope of products, and means of ensuring compliance with state and federal laws. In our experience, a framework of program requirements is sufficiently effective. However, imposing a requirement for an upfront financial guarantee, we believe, is not customary, not necessary, even according to Cal Recycling's EPR guidelines, not authorized by the statute and inconsistent with the statute's goals and intent. In the already well-managed automotive industry, requirements already exist for management of most hazardous automotive wastes, including oils, tires, brake fluid, filters, paints, solvents, coolants, without the imposition of financial guarantees. Volvo is a very small player in the automotive world. Overhead costs are already substantial for us. As a smaller company, from an actuarial standpoint, Volvo could be evaluated as a higher risk than a larger manufacturer. This could result in discriminatory pricing of financial guarantee instruments and put Volvo and all smaller manufacturers at an unfair economic disadvantage. Financial guarantees would also impose the impractical burden on manufacturers, importers, and retailers to continuously dedicate financial resources to non-performing use, when such resources would be better spent on research and development of safer alternatives. Section 69506.4 is sufficiently detailed and robust without the added requirement of a financial guarantee. Therefore, the concept of requiring a financial guarantee should be eliminated from the proposed regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Drew Wood, representing Children's Indoor Air Quality Interests. Is Drew here? Okay, we'll go to the next speaker. I had Robert Callahan, but Robert, I understood you want to speak later. Is that, you want to pass now?
Yeah, I'm fine for now.
Want to pass? All right. Stacy Ann Taylor with American Coatings Association.
Good morning. My name is Stacey Ann Taylor, and I am counsel in the Government Affairs Division of the American Coatings Association, or ACA. I have offered testimony at previous workshops on the draft regulations, and I felt it was equally important to be here with you all today. My colleague Steve Sides, our VP of Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy, is also here today. The ACA represents over 90% of the total domestic production of paints and coatings in the United States. Our membership includes paint and coatings manufacturers, raw material suppliers, distributors, as well as approximately 2,000 coatings formulators and scientists. The manufacture, sale, and distribution of paints and coatings is a $20 billion industry in the United States. Our industry operates in all 50 states and employs over 60,000 people engaged in manufacturing and distribution. The state of California currently represents approximately 18% of our domestic coating sales market. Excuse me. The ACA supports the general idea of greener chemistry and recognizes DTSC for the years of work that the agency has put into drafting and refining these regulations. We believe that the latest draft is indeed a step in the right direction. The latest draft certainly reflects DTSC's willingness to take ideas from industry, environmental groups, and the general public into serious consideration. However, we believe that it is still possible to further clarify and streamline these regulations before they are finalized. We want to briefly point out 3 sections of the draft where we see room for improvement. They are the chemicals of concern list, the de minimis exemption, and the timeline for completion of the AA reports. Of course, additional ideas and suggestions will be provided to DTSC on our formal comments, which we will submit later this month. The chemicals of concern list. The chemicals of concern list will obviously be quite substantial. We encourage DTSC to reconsider the idea of prioritizing, at least some portion of this list using risk-based analysis. Prioritizing this list will assist industry with future compliance efforts, as well as provide useful information for future product research and development. The de minimis exemption. We appreciate DTSC's effort to further clarify when and how the de minimis exemption may be used. However, we are disappointed to discover that the de minimis level offered is 10 times lower than the current level required by federal OSHA's HAZCOM standard. We are concerned that such a low de minimis level will be impossible to meet and therefore render this exemption completely useless. The timeline for completion of preliminary and final alternatives assessments reports. With respect to the preliminary AA, the current draft requires submission of the preliminary AA report no later than 6 months or 180 days after the product is listed on the final priority products list. We respectfully suggest that this time period should be increased in the regulations given the possibility that a manufacturer may have numerous formulations or variations of the same product, and each product may require its own depending on the circumstances. With respect to the final AA, the current draft requires final submission of the report no later than 12 months after DTSC issues a notice of compliance for the preliminary AA. Again, it is conceivable, based upon the way the draft is written, that a single manufacturer will have to submit multiple AAs for a product, and more time should be allowed for that possibility. Thank you for giving me the time to provide you with our comments.
Thank you, Stacy. Next commenter is Sarah Amick with the Rubber Manufacturers Association.
Hello. My name is Sarah Amick. I'm environmental counsel with the Rubber Manufacturers Association. We represent every major domestic tire manufacturer in the United States. They manufacture 80% of all replacement tires sold in the U.S. and 90% of OE tires for light vehicles. I offer the following comments and recommendations for DTSC to consider as you move forward in revising the draft informal regulation. First, I would just like to start out by saying that tire manufacturers manufacture tires for safety, to provide a safe driving experience for passengers and on all vehicles. First, we would like to ask DTSC to consider federal tire safety regulations required by NHTSA and corporate average fuel economy standard demands, or CAFE standards. The informal draft regulations contains requirements for chemical substitution that could jeopardize tire safety standards established by NHTSA, as well as achievement of automobile mileage requirements that have just been proposed by the US EPA and NHTSA. This may create a situation where a tire manufacturer may be unable to comply with both the proposed regulation and federal law. NHTSA requires that all tires meet safety, durability, and other standards prior to their sale to the consumer. The composition and nature of the chemicals present in tires impart a function, and the exact composition of tires cannot be modified without great care. It is not a simple process to change the composition of tires. Any change could affect the stopping distance of a tire, tire wear, and possibly other safety components. Modifying chemical composition can affect other components of tires as well, and typically requires several years of development and testing. Next, we'd like to ask DTSC to distinguish products based on their social utility. The draft regulation does not adequately take into account the difference between chemicals that are added for style, attractiveness, or other non-essential purposes, and chemicals that are part of complex mixtures whose presence in the product is necessary to impart an essential function, such as stopping distance, tire wear, and fuel economy of the tire. Most of the chemicals present in tires are included because over many years the design process has determined that the chemical works best among the components of the tire to impart a physical or chemical property to the tire that is essential for its function, which is safety. We urge DTSC to consider the essential function of a chemical in a product in revising the draft regulation. Next, we ask that DTSC should also consider activities located outside the state of California in requiring substitution of chemicals. The draft regulation requires consideration of impacts during all product life cycle stages. Thus, an adverse impact, and therefore a requirement to substitute a chemical, may be driven by a concern related to tire-derived fuel combustion, worker exposure in a tire manufacturing plant outside California, or tire manufacturing plant emissions in other states, even if they are in compliance with the state's air emission requirements. There simply are no methods to test or evaluate how tire composition changes may affect these other impacts. Additionally, the proposed regulation requirements for substitution of a chemical in tires in effect may require tire manufacturers to change virtually every environmental permit at their manufacturing plants, whether the plant is in California or not, because the substitution of a new chemical changes the environmental profile of the manufacturing facility. This can be an unreasonable regulatory burden without a clear benefit. If a conflict over environmental permits, including Clean Air Act permits in other states arose because of the need to substitute a new chemical in the tire manufacturing process, the tire companies may not be able to continue manufacturing, or at the very least, the time needed to complete the substitution would need to be extended. We urge DTSC to consider activities located outside the state of California in requiring the substitution of chemicals in consumer products. Next, we recommend DTSC exclude importers and retailers from the list of responsible parties. The latest draft includes manufacturers, importers, and retailers as responsible entities, with manufacturers being the principally or primarily responsible party. Retailers are required to comply only if a manufacturer or importer fails to comply, and DTSC notifies the retailer of the manufacturer's noncompliance. The informal draft regulation creates a contractual relationship between manufacturers, importers, and retailers and imposes joint and several liability on the parties. This contractual relationship between retailers, importers, and manufacturers is problematic for some RMA members that have tire retail outlets. The joint and several liability for tire manufacturers and their tire retail stores could result in multiple penalties for the same essential action. We believe that such liability is unfair. Because tire retailers and importers do not make decisions about the chemical composition in tires, it does not make sense to make them responsible for reporting an analysis of the chemical product information. Next, tire manufacturers distribute tires through national distribution chains and cannot control where a tire is ultimately distributed. We recommend DTSC take into account these national effects in revising the draft regulations. Again, we thank DTSC for this opportunity to provide comments, and we'll be submitting additional, more detailed written comments at the end of the month. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Next speaker is Terry Klein, representing General Motors.
Hello, my name is Terry Klein. I'm the manager of Environmental Facilities and Material Policy at GM, and I'm speaking on behalf of GM today. But I believe my comments address an issue that are faced by many manufacturers. GM appreciates the opportunity to provide comment to the California Safer Consumer Product Alternatives Regulation because consumer product safety and sustainability are priorities for GM, and we support the objectives of the Green Chemistry Initiative. The issue I'm focusing on today is the continued use and manufacture of legacy or replacement parts. This issue is important to the auto industry because an automobile is a durable consumer good. Consumers purchase cars with the expectation that they will possess them for many years. In fact, the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers estimates that the average car is retained by the original customer for approximately 12 years. Thus, the purchase of a vehicle is a significant investment for consumers, and they expect their cars to remain viable long after they're manufactured. So it's important that legacy parts continue to be available for the service and repair of those vehicles. Replacement parts for legacy vehicles cannot simply be interchanged with new parts designed for current vehicles. In fact, GM and other auto companies retain large inventories of service parts for previous model year vehicles. These parts may continue to be manufactured based on their demand, or sometimes they are built out at the end of a model year to accommodate a lifetime of parts for that vehicle, so the tooling can be retired. So the parts are already built out and have to be there or can't be replaced. Because vehicle design is constantly changing, there would be many instances where the newly designed part or system is not likely to fit or function properly in the previous model year vehicle still in use. If part of the product were to be redesigned or changed compositionally because of these rules, replacement parts designed for use prior to the redesign would still be required for use on some previous model year vehicles. These parts could not simply be pulled from the market, as that would leave vehicle owners without a way to repair and continue to use their automobiles. For example, if an airbag needed to be redesigned to incorporate a new material, the size of that airbag may need to be changed to accommodate the use of this new material because there might be a higher volume of that material needed to perform the function. Obviously, the larger airbags would no longer fit into the previous model year vehicles. California green chemistry law is forward-facing toward innovation into safer materials. The language of the statute is clear that its provisions apply to products prioritized and listed by the department, not to products that preceded that listing. For all these reasons, we urge DTSC to consider using a repair-as-built approach like that employed in other parts of the world, which allows continued use of replacement parts as originally designed. And we look forward to working with you further on this issue. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide these comments here today.
Thank you, Terry. Our next speaker is Dan Adzil of the Ford Motor Company.
My name's Dan Atzett. I'm an environmental engineer at Ford, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. I wanted to talk a little bit about our chemical tracking system, and we gave you some information on our chemical tracking system, but we really didn't tell you how we got to where we're at. And so I want to give you a little bit of history about that, and I also want to tell you about the effect of the draft regulation on what we have in place. So in 1998, the automakers got together with electronic data systems and put in place a material data system to track, an IT system to track materials. The system went live in 2000, and at the time, automakers had their own independent chemical lists that they were asking suppliers to track. Well, because of the complexity of suppliers reporting on all these different lists, that didn't work out so well. So the automakers got together and put together a common list of substances in 2005. The list that we put together is based on regulations, projected regulations, and also on testing which has showed a chemical to be associated with hazards to human health or the environment. So with a common data system, common chemical list, and standardized reporting requirements, it was possible for us to get material information from hundreds of global suppliers into the system. And then once that data was in the system, we could track the material content of our vehicles, which are typically comprised of over 30,000 parts. Developing this system was a decade-long effort. And although the majority of automakers were using the system by 2005, some still joined the system later. Today we have over 200,000 users of the system, and we have over 34 million material data sheets in the system. So the amount of time and effort and money that we expended creating this system was substantial. Major automakers invested over $30 million in just developing the system. And each year, in addition, the major automakers spend millions of dollars in maintenance and dues for the system. The effectiveness of the system largely rested on its standardization. So when you're dealing with the complex projects and large numbers of suppliers in multiple countries, it's critical to have a common substance list and common reporting requirements. We also understand that substances of concern will grow over time, and we have a committee of experts that meet every year to review substances of concern and add them as necessary to our list. The tracking level of substances used in the system is 0.1%, which conforms with global standards, and we encourage you to develop or to use that same de minimis level in your regulations. Lowering the de minimis level, as you suggest in your draft regulation, will drive the use of more expensive testing procedures throughout our supply chain, and it will increase the amount of unintentionally added substances that are tracked in our system. It will, I mean, the system is big already, and doing that is going to make it even larger, and we think it'll add data that you really don't want, kind of confusing the issue. Additionally, we track 2,700 substances right now in our list. So if we go from 2,700 substances to the 3,000 substances that are roughly on your list of lists, you might think that that's, 300 substance change, not a big deal, but it is a big deal. It takes a lot of time and effort to track that number of substances and to get our supply base to report on it. So it's not an inconsequential change. So we encourage you to change your de minimis level to 0.1% and to refine your list, bearing in mind the kind of costs that this causes industry. We support green chemistry, and we believe that the goal of green chemistry should be on replacing substances of concern in parts. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's not a reporting exercise. And we can tell you, we have a lot of experience in gathering reporting information, that it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, you want to collect what you want to affect. So we really encourage you to rethink the de minimis, put it at 0.1%, and think very carefully about the size of your lists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is Julia Regs, hope I'm pronouncing that right. Apologize if I'm not, from the Association of Global Automakers.
Good morning. My name is Julia Regs, but I answer to Reg A too because it sounds so much better. I'm the Senior Manager for Environment and Energy at the Association of Global Automakers. Global Automakers represents international motor vehicle manufacturers, original equipment suppliers, and other automotive-related trade associations. Our members include Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Hyundai, Kia, and Subaru. Our members' U.S. market share for both sales and production is 40% and growing. I appreciate this opportunity to share what we believe is constructive input for moving forward on the safer consumer products regulations. We recognize that DTSC has been working hard to balance not only the requirements of the laws, but also the input from a wide array of stakeholders. We would like to make clear that we support the overarching goals of the regulations, but also believe, as currently drafted, they may create an unworkable system. I would first like to recognize the considerable progress that has been made in several areas. The movement from multiple chemical and product lists to one list each has added precision to the process and removed some of the uncertainty that multiple iterations of lists created. DTSC has also added clarity to who must comply and has made clear that all parties along the supply chain have a duty to comply. The most recent regulations also refer to the need to provide guidance for the alternative assessment process beyond the regulations. This will be essential for meaningful compliance. At the November Green Ribbon Science Panel meeting, DTSC reiterated that these regulations need to be meaningful, practical, and legally defensible. We cannot agree more, and in that spirit offer these comments. Meaningful. DTSC has frequently stressed that they need to work on the most important chemical and product combinations first. In order to accomplish that goal, we recommend that DTSC focus on a small number of chemical and product combinations that have well-characterized and significant hazards, demonstrated exposure, and existing alternatives. Risk-based priority setting system. By making strategic policy choices at the beginning, DTSC can assure that both Cal EPA and the regulated community can learn by doing and ensure a greater possibility of success. History has shown us that by overloading such a new regulatory system, it can crumble under its own weight. Practical. We are concerned that starting with over 3,000 chemicals will overwhelm DTSC's ability to focus on the highest priority concerns. We recommend culling down the list by using a screening process focused on high hazard candidates. We are not suggesting that other lists be exempted, just deferred until later in the process. As a start, DTSC could focus on carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxicants that are persistent and bioaccumulative. To further refine the list, we recommend removing chemicals that are regulated or under review by other agencies. We strongly recommend that DTSC reconsider the common sense exemptions that were included in earlier versions. These include exemptions for no exposure pathway and unintentionally present, and a de minimis level of 0.1%. As proposed, the de minimis for assembled products is really no de minimis at all. If based on the cumulative concentration of all chemicals of concern with the same mode of action and same toxicological endpoint for each product, then the exemption will rarely be available for use. By including these exemptions, DTSC and the regulated community can focus already limited resources on higher priority, meaningful issues. Legally defensible. Global Automakers believes that much has been done to refine and focus the regulations, but we also believe there are a number of remaining requirements that push the envelope in terms of evolving science policies and practices that need to be carefully considered before application in the regulations. For example, requirements related to aggregate and cumulative exposures may be premature, as there is still a great deal of uncertainty in terms of approaches and interpretation, especially for consumer products. Similarly, Global Automakers understands the desire to have a comprehensive set of hazard traits and endpoints to evaluate chemicals and products. However, with emerging fields of study such as endocrine disruption and epigenetics, it is important to make sure that accepted and scientifically valid test methods are in place. For both of these modes, test methods are still under development. Until there is general agreement in the scientific community that valid, acceptable test methods are available, it would be premature to require testing based on these concerns. Generation of data that may ultimately prove to be inadequate or erroneous may be misleading and counterproductive. In the interim, voluntary generation of such data should be encouraged. In closing, Global Automakers appreciates the opportunity to provide these comments on the draft regulations, and we will be offering additional written comments by the close of the comment period. Our goal is to assure that whatever regulatory scheme is put in place is one that is focused, effective, and workable, or as DTSC has articulated, meaningful, practical, and legally defensible. We welcome ongoing opportunities to work collaboratively with DTSC. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And the last speaker who we requested time by email is Paul DeLeo with the American Cleaning Institute.
Good morning. My name is Paul DeLeo. I'm Senior Director of Environmental Safety at the American Cleaning Institute. Thank you for this chance to comment on the safer consumer product regulations. I wanted to take this opportunity to discuss the need for thresholds in several areas of the regulation to improve their clarity. There are a number of situations where the lack of a threshold leads to the improper characterization of a chemical as a chemical of concern or as having an impact. I'd like to focus on a couple of quick examples and identify other areas that need attention. The proposed definition of bioaccumulation is contrary to the scientific consensus on that definition, namely that bioaccumulation is the biomagnification of a chemical in food webs. Moreover, the regulations do not speak to how bioaccumulation should be measured and what threshold constitutes a bioaccumulative chemical. There are at least 5 ways to measure the potential for a chemical to bioaccumulate: the octanol water partition coefficient, the octanol air partition coefficient, bioconcentration factor, bioaccumulation factor, and trophic magnification factor. Each of these have thresholds for which there is scientific and regulatory consensus as to what constitutes a bioaccumulative chemical. The regulation should include these means of measure and the consensus thresholds. Similarly, the definition of persistence is vague and scientifically inaccurate. First, it should be clear that the definition is not relevant to inorganic elements in compounds, as they will not be transformed in the environment. The regulations should also recognize that persistence is typically measured as a half-life with respect to a particular environmental medium. For example, freshwater, marine water, soil, sediment, and air. The regulations should include the thresholds for which there is scientific and regulatory consensus as to what constitutes a persistent chemical, namely a half-life of greater than 60 days in marine and freshwater, greater than 180 days in soil and sediment, and greater than 2 days in air. Finally, there are a number of other places in the regulations where meaningful thresholds should be established so as to avoid the erroneous conclusion that a substance has an adverse impact by virtue of a single molecule being introduced to the environment. Those areas include the definition of air quality impacts, the effects identified in the definition of adverse soil quality impacts, acute and chronic toxicity in the definition of adverse ecological impacts, and the definition of adverse water quality impacts. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Paul. We're now ready. Let's see, we have 20 minutes before lunch, so I think we'll start with some commenters who submitted cards today, and Sue Patel. There's Sue's back there. She's going to be calling you up.
Thank you, Odette. First, I have Chris Sidney from Chrysler.
Good morning. My name is Christopher Sidney, and I'm a Regulatory Affairs Program Manager speaking on behalf of the Chrysler Group. Let me start off by saying that the Chrysler Group wholeheartedly embraces the concept of green chemistry and supports the ideals that California and specifically the DTSC are trying to achieve. I think it's fair to say that those of you here today have consistently seen both my company and my fellow members of the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers well represented during the development of AB 1879 and the subsequent rulemaking efforts of the past 2 years. Whether in person, via the Green Chemistry Alliance, or the American Chemistry Council, we've steadfastly worked together to help California achieve its goals in a realistic and practical manner. Let me also give credit where it's due. The informal draft rules released by DTSC on October 31st, 2011 have shown some evolution in DTSC's thinking. Our industry feels that several of our key concerns are being addressed and that in general the document is much clearer than previous versions. Chrysler certainly appreciates your efforts. But I still struggle with the process described in the rule. AB 1879 requires that DTSC develop a rule that specifically defines the process in which chemicals will be prioritized. The rule does not contain a prioritization process, but rather a list of approximately 3,000 chemicals and all of OEHA's 40-plus hazard traits for potential action. The rule merely defines a large scope of chemicals and characteristics for consideration, but without describing what makes something within that scope a priority. While a nod is made to include the concept of de minimis, one would assume that the chemicals on the priority list that must be reported at the 0.01% threshold would bear greater concern. Since my understanding is that the auto industry may be one of the few with resources to capture and manage information at the 0.1% level, I question why a threshold would be chosen that even one of the most robust systems today cannot achieve. Furthermore, DTSC adds uncertainty to its de minimis position by ultimately stating that while de minimis levels appear to be established, DTSC can change them as it merits appropriate. During a time of recession and high unemployment, the last thing that the manufacturing industry needs is further unpredictability and uncertainty. With respect to chemical accountability, we have shared information on our Global Automotive Declarable Substance List, a process for tracking and communicating nearly 2,700 chemicals of concern relevant to the auto industry. Between our industry's tracking software and the Gadsel chemical list, Chrysler and our industry partners have spent millions of dollars in over 8 years to simply address EU end-of-life regulations and now REACH. The proposed DTSC list contains hundreds of additional chemicals that will take years of additional time, money, and the cooperation of thousands of global suppliers to acquire, not to mention the cost passed down to the consumer for those efforts. In short, while the current draft shows some improvement, it continues to embrace concepts from previous drafts that either pose near impossible challenges to our industry or requirements not authorized by AB 1879. In your efforts to ensure that no chemical or product could possibly be excluded from your purview, no process was developed to effectively prioritize chemicals or priority products, a mandatory element of the statute. Without a focused, science-based prioritization process in place, I fear that the innovation that was desired will fail to occur. Let me end my statement by presenting DTSC with a question. While my organization considers the need to spend limited resources obtaining significant additional chemical information and perhaps a year or more conducting a single alternatives analysis at the potential cost of $1 million, potentially funding and managing both an end-of-life program and an escrow account for my financial guarantee, where will the resources to innovate come from? Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Next is Don Kipke with Green Chemistry Alliance and CMTA.
Good morning. Dawn Kepke with McHugh and Associates Government Relations on behalf of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, and also one of two co-chairs along with John Ulrich of the Green Chemistry Alliance. Pleased to be back here again with you all today, and on behalf of the Green Chemistry Alliance and CMTA, we appreciate the openness DTSC has offered in terms of working on these regulations over the last 3 years with the Green Chemistry Alliance and its stakeholders. We really do appreciate the ability to come in and chat with you guys at every turn. As you know, the Green Chemistry Alliance in particular represents over 150 trade associations and individual companies, both here in the state as well as at the national and international level. And we've advocated all along for a workable and science-based program. We think we're starting to get to a point where we're definitely seeing some positives in the regulations. For example, starting small with the purported 2 to 5 chemical product combinations. We understand that that's not something you're planning to put specifically in the regulations, but we do agree and have said all along that we think starting small to get the program off the ground and running is a smart move. Also, focusing on true consumer products is really important as well in terms of a practical approach to getting the program off the ground and meaningful as well. In terms of the alternatives assessment, we appreciate the attempts to provide flexibility in the AA process, and also the emphasis on the work plan and using that to provide the path forward for manufacturers to develop their AA around their particular product and needs. Also, relative to certified assessors, we appreciate and look forward to working with you a little bit more on that element of this, but certainly also appreciate that approach versus the third-party certification previously contemplated. We appreciate the opportunity to allow for company completed AAs rather than going outside at all turns. Speaking of concerns, however, we do continue to have a number of them, all of which at some point in that concern touch on the practical, meaningful, and legally defensible issues. First of all, starting with the interplay with the Safer Consumer Products Regulation, as it interplays with the OEHA hazard trait regulation. We do continue to have concerns with how the two work together and the breadth of the OEHA hazard trait regulation as it applies here, particularly when you're looking at some of the implications for the alternatives assessment in that regard. Also, with regard to regulatory duplication, we think that the language in the draft regulation is more narrow than what the statute provides for, and we're concerned that many products that are already regulated at the state and federal level could be caught up in the program despite the fact that they are already regulated and overseen at those levels. You've all heard a lot about the chemicals of concern list. I don't think it's any surprise that the Green Chemistry Alliance, CMTA, and its members have a number of concerns with the chemical of concern list of lists and how that was developed. The fact that it contains over 3,000 chemicals, not to mention classes of chemicals, is of great concern to us. And ultimately, it seems as though we're taking the periodic table of elements and slowly but surely listing them all as chemicals of concern when they're the building blocks of life products and what have you. And that's certainly, from our perspective, not something that's practical or meaningful relative to this program. And we're concerned that it covers it's so broad and redundant that that could be concerning from a practical standpoint, as well as the concern that the various lists are not based on consistent criteria across those various lists. And so that's a major concern on that point as well. And I would just note that relative to the concerns we have with the chemical of concern list, I mean, Tim Malloy, Green Ribbon Science Panel member, whom we don't always agree with on all issues, also voiced concerns along these lines that when you have this many chemicals on a chemical of concern list as chemicals of concern, you start to get away from the practical and meaningful, because if everything's a concern, nothing's more of a concern. Also issues related to substances and chemicals that are already regulated and may be exempted by the statute, drugs, pesticides. We know that you have talked about pulling those out of the list. I think the concern there may be if they're not explicitly exempted in the regulation, how you would go about doing that, because ultimately if you're adopting those lists wholesale, there could potentially be some market concerns for those type of substances being on those lists. You've adopted these lists as lists of chemicals of concern, and so we're still kind of trying to figure that out, but that is a potential concern that those could still be in the manufacturing world listed and presumed as a chemical of concern. Wow, I am way short on time. So I'll just speed along. Concern with lists, these lists not necessarily being created based on use and exposure of a chemical in a product, more on hazards. There was also mentioned previously about no process for the specific removal of chemicals from the list. I know you spoke to that earlier. We really would like it to be more explicit that that opportunity for removal will be in the regulation. Product prioritization process, we're concerned that it's not clear how products with chemicals of concern in them would be identified and how you would get from the 3,000 plus chemicals of concern down to that 2 to 5. We think that that's still unclear. Relative to the Minimis threshold, you've heard a lot from other industry partners and members of the Green Chemistry Alliance and CMTA on that, so I won't belabor that point, but certainly we remain concerned about the 0.01% threshold on that point. And then as far as alternatives assessments, we have concerns with time frames on that point as well. I mean, ultimately, we are continuing to look forward to working with DTSC and other stakeholders. We are in the process of developing comments as well as solutions to some of the concerns we've outlined today and those that we'll be further discussing with you at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Let's see. I think we have time for one more speaker.
Okay, it's Maureen Gorson with Alstron and Bird.
Thank you. I'm so happy to go before lunch. I'm only going to be talking about one provision, the inventory recall provision in section 69506.5. I strongly urge DTSC to delete this provision. First, it's not authorized by the statute. Second, it really cannot be read into the statute by virtue of the language quote, and other regulatory responses, as the statute's provisions are forward-facing, not backward-facing. A recall is inconsistent with the forward-looking infrastructure of the statute, which is to stimulate investments in greener chemistries and to facilitate and stimulate redesign of products to greener materials and designs, not punishment for the less green designs of today and yesterday. So basically what you're saying when you include a recall provision is, once you've done your AA and you've discovered a greener alternative, the present product is less green. And when you include a recall provision, you're saying, aha, you should never have sold something yesterday or today that's less green than something more green you could have sold tomorrow. So the backward-looking inventory recall provision is not consistent with the statutory vision. Third, a quick review of inventory recall provisions of other federal consumer product regulatory schemes like the Food and Drug Administration, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration indicates that the Green Chemistry Statute and the safer consumer product regulations lack the basic prerequisites to run a successful inventory recall, specifically a safety standard that is predictable and reliable and measured quantitatively by established test methods upon which a recall can be based and predicted. And fourth, I would note that 2 of the Cali PA consumer product regulatory programs, the pesticide program and the CARB VOC program, run quite effectively without recalls and allow for the continued sale of existing inventory that is quote unquote in the stream of commerce. So in sum, the inventory recall is a throwaway provision. It's not necessary to effectuate the statute. It's not authorized by the statute. It's inconsistent with the statute's purpose and goals, and DTSC lacks the prerequisites to successfully effectuate the recall. Delete it and you'll save yourself a lot of headaches. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Maureen. Let's see. Let's do one more.
Stephanie Abundo. She's a public citizen, mother of 4.
Okay, hello, my name is Stephanie Abundo, and thank you for hearing me now. These are the 3 boys and Sophia. So I'm from Davis, California. I'm the mother of 4 children, ranging in ages from 2 to 9, and I have tried hard to minimize my children's exposure to toxins such as the chemicals of concern that we're talking about today. However, there's only so much as an individual that I can do, which is why we need better consumer protection. As a mother, I am deeply concerned that babies and children are being exposed to many toxins while their bodies and brains are still developing and are very vulnerable to exposure. A study by the Environmental Working Group and Commonweal showed an average of 200 industrial chemicals and pollutants in umbilical cord blood from babies born in 2004 in the United States. We need to give babies a better future than this. In addition to the regulations expressed in the draft, I would also like to see chemicals of concerns that are unintended manufacturing byproducts to be covered by the regulation. I am here to express my support for the Safer Consumer Products Regulation. I ask that it not be diluted or weakened due to industry pressure, and that the protection of children is its highest priority. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's noon or close enough too, so let's take our lunch break and resume at 1 o'clock, and we will start up again on comment cards. If any of you would like to speak and have not submitted a card, now's your opportunity to do so. Thank you.